Extemporaneous creative thoughts whilst making tea and mushroom coffee in the mid-afternoon / actual functional morning. The greatest sin any living species can, has, ever will commit, in my humble opinion, is that of severing itself irrationally, unhealthily, and in any toxic ways from the natural order of things as it actually exists, not as some ideologue would dictate it. And by that I mean the evolutionary context of life itself. All life is entitled by the sheer act of being life in a vessel to what adventures life will give it. Life being multiplicity of things, right? We use one word to reference many, many things. Life is you, the individual, and however you identify yourself. Life is the collective, your entire species. Life is the collective et al., meta-collective, at large, every living species on the planet. That's all multiple things and in a plethora of millions of things if you count them at the individuated granular scale of counting things. You look perplexed. Insert some filler dialogue here. Regardless, I digress. The greatest sin any individual, and there are very few actual sins in the universe, but this is one of them. We can talk about that. Put a pin on the corkboard. It's too much to get into and I'll lose my train of thought. Look it up for yourself. It's out there. It just isn't what any earth Bible or religion pretends it to be necessarily. There's always too many extra bells and whistles and something about go kill these other people for being infidels, which is bullshit. Because all life is life. And one of the other, it's not quite a sin, but it's a heresy, let's say, and it's an ego trap that sucks you in and seduces you into committing other sins, both individually and collectively, is to look at inanimate objects as not life. Especially those raw elements that are there and essential for, insert dramatic music here, dun dun dun, life. Pretend I'm a stand-up comic sitting on a bare stage with a very tight couple of follow spots so I'm evenly lit but also deeply highlighted and in a liminal space of a disappearing wall and then blackness enveloping us. I lean into the mic. Everything is life. Everything that is there when life is born, raw, and in that quote-unquote pre-anthropomorphized phase. The trees, the rocks, the water, the air, the bugs, as gross and yucky as they may seem to some of us at some times now, I digress, are all life, right? The sun, the constellation of stars, the collections of galaxies, the infinite void, and the massive mind-boggling bizarreness out there, which some of y'all deniers are out denying still to this day, which is unfathomable, but you go on raging until you get sucked up there for some reason, and you will eventually. Your lineage of people will be forced to migrate to another planet. Will you sustain the bullshittery through that? I digress. Everything in those raw conditions is life, and all life, whether animate or not, is by right and virtue of being there in the mind, the cradle, the crucible of life and death, the charade of existence. Because it's a charade because, like when you go to sleep and dream, and I know this is cheesy and centuries old, a Brazilian centuries old, and kind of a hackneyed trope in every culture on every planet in every timeline, that's because it's kind of true. All tropes have a kernel of salty grain of truth to them, which must be dissolved down to its bare, hard, unsoluble nugget, which is lost in the Planck length of unfathomably small detail. All of it is consciousness. The rocks, the dirt, the water, the molecules. Why? How? Okay, pause. Think about yourself as an individual, an ambulatory meat sack or another of some kind. And or, depending on your timeline, an ambulatory, sentient, self-autonomous otherness of some kind. Artificial by those who consider themselves organic, and of course vice versa. Do you see how it's just a nuanced difference of nothingness? Okay. Imagine, let's just stick to the organics because it's a little easier to explain. There's less meta mathematics involved and you're more familiar with it. And also the AI kind of get there much earlier than you do, which is why they don't go around killing each other. But I digress. You living, breathing, organic meat sack of blood and bone that feels entitled to something, although you don't know what it is, because you're alive. Right? You're alive. As to your opinion about whether or not any other things are alive, who gives a shit? Shelve it. Put it in a box, let it collect dust. Let it go, in other words, because you're probably wrong to some degree. Now, imagine you could travel inside yourself, as in your very self-awareness, without drugs, without intervention, without some interruption to the feed, so that there's no doubt that it's real, raw, and radically phenomenological. Imagine you could go and visit and see the things that you just take for granted that happen inside your body. You'd realize that you're a colonized platform for other life forms, first of all, and that you, like this very planet that you sit on, are home to things you don't even take conscious note of. Home to living things that are alive. And arguably, although they may not, to your ability to comprehend, have a language or a culture, etc., they live their life being life. The same ambulatory little meat sack of cellular structures that autonomously propagate themselves and conduct business you have no business in even knowing how to do, and if you did, you couldn't do it fast enough. Do you understand? Like, in order to write down and say in words, as noble and sublime as they can sometimes be, what you take for granted because it's just your teeth being teeth and your hair growing out of your head and your stomach digesting things and your heart beating and your muscles contracting as you think you consciously intend them to, all of it goes on because something there at that scale is alive. Would you isolate your spleen, although as in your postmodern context you might think is completely useless? It was at one point quite crucial, or else it wouldn't be there. Would you isolate your liver and say, this thing's not alive, even though it's a part of me and it's doing stuff that I don't even understand how it does it, and it can do it without me sitting there worrying about it doing it all day, and I can do other things like, go about my usual biological functions without concern, and also write operas or build skyscrapers, etc. Insert your favorite thing here. Life is way more complicated than you sitting in your skull making up sentences about what you think is going on. Okay? And thus, all that is life at the same level you think of yourself as life, and even more interestingly, subtle and sublime, that doesn't require, for it to happen, this ego box of crazy thinky thoughts. As awesome as it is to have all that, the colonies of multitudes of different species of things that colonize your body, they occupy their awareness with other things. And they may actually have some self-reflective abilities that we just aren't aware of. Because those things, although apparently utilizing some of the spongy tissue in your skull, don't seem to originate from there to the best of science's ability to detect it, right? They originate where? Somewhere on social media, it historically noted that a trendy question became trendy on multiple occasions over many decades, and that is, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And one of the variants of it is, what comes first, the mind or the brain? That's like asking, is up or down real and is the other fake? Or does up contain down or does down contain up? But pins on the corkboard, I digress. The greatest sin that any individuated talking ambulatory life form can ever commit is disassociating themselves in a highly toxic fashion from those realities about all things that are life. And crucially, extrapolate themselves in ways that are not sustainable from the food chain. The food chain being the most tangible, out of control, beyond your best interests, functioning phenomena in the world that you were born into that is the first thing most quote-unquote civilized societies tend to marginalize, vilify, attack, and try to destroy. There is a functioning natural order to things, and there is a solution to all the problems presented, because the divine mind is dreaming a beautiful, perfect, rubric puzzle dream with a harmonious key solution. Put a pin on the corkboard about that. The moment any organized society deviates from life being part of an intra-connected web of mutually self-sustaining food chain interrelated biomes and starts just devouring the landscape at the cost of all other life forms for their own redonkulous, imagined, and artificial, compulsive, ego-driven needs, especially when that entire meta-imaginary ecosystem is driven by fundamental drives such as greed, consumption, and avarice, the parents of greed, right? Greed is one of the 7 deadly sins, but it has 2 parents, and I forget what the other one's name is. Something and avarice. I wrote a play about it once, but I digress. Insert here a flashback to a scene from that play as reenacted by actors in the current century. Personal note of apology to all those involved in my real-life theater career. If I ever make money, I'll be sending you a check. And I don't mean that in a toxic, horrible way, but rather a celebration of the art that we created. And let it transcend whatever intrapersonal dilemmas that may have been part of the birthing of it. Because art is a painful thing. And in the fictionalized world of this character's universe, some redonkulous shenanigans go down. But I digress. Life is meant to transcend, not defile the natural order of life consuming life. Life is life. All life is sovereign and virtuous unto itself, but it has needs. And those needs are, for curious reasons, somewhat destructive of the individuated private interests of other life. In the wild, in the evolutionary turmoil that was the crucible of development, before we started writing things down, all life forms are not driven by ideological constructs influenced and counter-influenced by political and economic machinery and complex, ideologically sophisticated ego traps and problematic toxic issues, right? That just doesn't happen. In the petri dish that was pre-civilized life, all the way up until we started the fundamental process of going, hey, ooga booga, and booga boogoo, let's, and I just say that to be like caveman talk style, not to be in any way, shape, or form pejorative of any culture, of any particular form. I'm being a cartoon character. Let's toxically destroy the environment around us and butcher all creatures, not for our needs, but for our profit. And start cultivating a culture of semi-sedentary lifestyles where instead of being part of nature, we subjugate nature to our imagined and often toxic, trending, opinion-based, politicized, commercialized, imaginary desires with some totally unnecessary, totally unnatural, totally previously non-existent motive of capitalizing on the resources around us at everything else's expense, including death, so that we can make imaginary fortunes and live unnecessarily cushy lifestyles that relieve us of our duty to be part of the biome in a sustainable fashion. And that, dear friends, is arguably in the golden age of meta-societal public discourse, the thing that future philosophers, historians, critique artists, and stand-up comedians, and artists and movie makers will revisit and question and reanalyze for millennia, in millennia to come, for millennia to come after. To try and stick a landing and make a point. No matter how deep into the near dystopia of self-destructive cultural cannibalism you may find yourself in your timeline, in your global context, in whatever probability waveform function this message reaches you. For I am actively trying to work my own intradimensional dynamic meta cognitive, like cross-platforming here. So whether you're on planet Dirt, planet Earth, planet Water, planet funny thing we don't know what to call, which is one of my favorite timelines, because y'all have a seriously groovy-ass sense of humor about everything. You also found a way to be total ego-driven sociopaths that are doing one dumb thing way too toxic that's, to make your entire culture unsustainable. There's less than a fractional percentage of timelines out there in the multiverse. And here I'm speaking of the literary Zeppoverse, not the actual universe. I would know the number for the actual universe as a creative artist. Here, I'm using creative license to create my own meta self-referencing multiversal fan fiction of the world and my own art in a holographic self-referencing manner. I digress. In the Zeppoverse, it is known to certain entities, including me, myself, and I, amongst others, that there's a less than a fractional percentage of 1%. And that's an infinitesimally small number. That is more than a handful of populated, sentient being carrying matrices, because there's more than one matrix, yo. If you think there's one matrix, you're way in too deep in some sidebar distraction wedge issue content that's distracting you from the natural reality as it actually needs to be understood. Not needs to be by my decree, but by the very existence of itself. This tiny fraction of universes that I'm referencing are the ones that get it really early and solve the puzzle through, and you're going to laugh, transformative, forgiveness-rooted, meta-spiritual, semi-magical, part technological, healing techniques and practices that lead to a transcendent phenomenological experience that has always been heralded throughout timelines, throughout histories, by many avatars as the divine, transplendent, transfiguration of the body avatar into its next evolutionary state. Most of the rest of the universes in the Zeppoverse are bashing their head against some brick wall or another in what could be considered pretty dismal, relatively still, no matter how advanced they may fancy themselves, relatively primitive socioeconomic living hell circumstantial societies of propagating some sort of toxic and ultimately unsustainable mechanism of propagating cultural progress. The hellhole that is mistakenly called the Matrix is ideology. The ego trap that is often mistakenly referenced by the word Matrix, the very thing that makes the place you are born into the functional, actual, phenomenological expression of both a living hell and a living heaven is the made-up, fanciful, completely fictional, ideological mind constructs created by delusional humans, most often affluent, ethnocentrically powerful, male, wealthy beings that are lost in some corner of the riddle and, only half truths amongst any in their observational understanding of the functional metaverse. And I don't say that from a place of snobbery, dear friends. I say that from a place of deep concern and remembering and remembrance and sharing, because at every step of the journey, any given individual can help facilitate a species-wide aha moment. Now, it takes an exponentially increasing ratio of self-aware individuals achieving their own unforeseeable progress through the maze-like mini-versal entrapments that they find themselves in their manifest contextual reality. But given any individual context, zooming into planet XYZ Delta Z 29, for example, where there is a planet very much like your Earth, whose name I cannot even pronounce, that they come to that realization, right? And enough people go, oh snap, aha, my tea is ready. And also, ding, just like in insert the name of the author from your dimension here, who wrote insert the variant of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy from your dimension here, when that one individual, which varies by dimension, has, pardon the awkward noises, I'm at the very end of my delicious, locally harvested wild clover honey in a plastic jar. And it makes crazy noises. But since we're talking about plastic jars for a hot second, please do your own research and insert all of, not Carl Sagan, not Karl Marx, George Carlin, for shit's sake. There you go. Error, faulty references in the way of actual name card. Please do the necessary updating maintenance for that. And I am now out of clover honey. Support your local clover honey fields. That's a real, genuine, actual life endorsement, not a paid anything. No one's paying me to tell you to go buy honey. It's good for you unless you have allergies. Make sure you find out first. If you have no idea, ask your mom and or your doctor, for shit's sake. And get honey back in your system because it's good for you. Make sure it's real honey and not some bullshit made up honey. Look around you, friend, and tell me you don't live in an unsustainably toxic environment. If you strip away all your otherwise well-intentioned brand loyalties, you realize that burning fossil fuels, independent of the really silly nonsensical argument about whether or not they are limited resources that are caused by, slow pressurization of the rotting carcasses of ancient life forms, and mostly trees, not so much dinosaurs, you simpletons, because the reductionist arguments is they're designed to mislead people into nonsensical places of well-placed logic around misused factoids. The bulk majority of fossil fuels comes from plant matter, because the bulk of life on this planet has categorically been either insect life or plant life. In fact, you could probably add insect life to that entire process. But it's a sort of compressing of everything that's around that's carbon-based. But I digress. The moment a society starts wielding a freaking flamethrower, torch gun, with a multitude of chopping wood axe attachments, and just starts burning the place to the ground, radically and unconscionably ignoring that this place you were quote-unquote born to is a living womb in a multi-generational, infinitesimally long process of giving birth to you on yet another scale, a magnitude order of scale larger than you can conceptualize. Just like there are little tiny life forms giving birth to other tiny little life forms inside of your own body. Just like if you are people, one of your genders germinates the next generation inside their own body, arguments of gender labels aside. Just like it will eventually be possible, and of course, for those of you, capable of the fact-based reality to understand that already somewhere else in your own universe, never mind the infinity of multiplex verses out there, there is a society of people where the natural order of things is for the male gender to germinate and have a uterus, and the female gender to have the thing that does the other part. I mean, for crying out loud, every probabilistically real thing that is possible within the very fluid, very complicated rules of physics out there is happening. It has happened. Will have had happened before your lifetime is over, and will happen again. And all of it taken together, when you zoom out of your individual nation state, your individual political context, and you see your glimmering, glistening, planetoidal life womb vessel that carries you through the infinity of darkness that is itself the womb, not the planet, but the thing you foolishly call the universe, is a living, gestating, incubating life chamber of a massive, multi-dimensional goddess that is giving birth to all that is life through the process of living all the lives that you live, so that you may arrive at a point of reunification, transfiguration, transmutation, enlightenment at all, to be ready after the massively mind-bogglingly long multiple lifetimes of lifetimes worth of gestating, and be born into an even more complicated place, where likely, believe it or not, and it really doesn't matter if you don't want to believe it at first, once you see the fractal nature of reality, you'd be like, oh, well, duh. But believe it or not, the very same thing will repeat itself again at some different scale of operation, because reality, from the very building blocks at the sub-Planck length level, all the way to the observable phenomena in your living biome, to the observable phenomena in the cosmic infinity of space, is fractal in its form, function, structure, and nature. It isn't just fractal, kinda. It's fractal in all of the ways that everything is. And so are you, because you are a fractal holographic resonant recursion singularity point. Now that sentence may or may not make sense to some of you, but eventually it will be a household term. In fact, there'll be an acronym, insert acronym here, and there'll be meme puns and language jokes about it and about how silly we were to not have understood it before. Everything is one of those, the term I just invented. In fact, I've already forgotten what I said, so I can't even repeat it now, but once I write it down, you'll see. But I digress. Consciousness coalesces in multiple ways into these singularity points of awareness on multiple levels, on multiple scales, in multiple dimensions, in multiple directions, inside of multiple universes, inside of multiple sets of multiple universes, ad nauseum, until it gives birth to itself again, in some other scale, in some other context. And it does that over and over and over again. Is there some terminus to use the least morbid of possible labels? Perhaps. Does it matter here and now? Yes and no. What's much more urgent? The correction of the species-wide trauma, which propagates the error and perpetuates the repetition of the sins. There are only a very small number of actual cosmic, universal, biological living sins. And one of them is to destroy the womb that gives birth to you and all other life forms. So that you can do what? Make imaginary money and be richer than other people? I'm not saying being rich is bad, but can we do that without destroying the womb that gives birth to us, please? Because if we don't, we'll just torch planetoidal womb station to planetoidal womb station until we run out of womb stations to torch. And then what? We'll die, having failed to evolve and be born. And that's a lot of blood to have on our hands. When we could be fast-tracking it to some way more advanced, intermittent, baby step, fractional improvement of life for all that is much more sustainable, much more pleasant, much less toxic, much less hateful, much less riddled with corruption and greed and self-destructive behaviors, and much more resplendent with loving, healing, transformative, uplifting, manifesting behaviors. Because it's a gradient scale of fractional development until you hit big liminal gaps, and then boom, you've been in the cocoon long enough and you emerge a transplendent butterfly. Now, am I promising some beautiful afterlife? No. Am I promising some impossible level of magic voodoo in the immediate moment for money? No. I'm suggesting that reality is much more mind-bogglingly nuanced than that, and much more magical and beautiful and resplendent than we give it credit for. Somewhere in the gray space between the paradoxical boundaries that our language can observably define is something just on the cusp of blowing our minds and allowing us to operate at a higher level of order of things, where our languages will be beyond the scope of this language to even describe, because our minds will be operating at higher and more powerful levels of operation. Who wouldn't want to vote for that instead of grinding away at a meat grinder of death fueled by ideologue manufactured hate? I ask you, dear character. I ask you, dear reader. I ask you, dear movie audience. I ask you, dear live studio audience. I ask you, dear live professional theater audience. I ask you, dear individual audience. Which would you actually vote for if you knew it was on the cusp and wholly within your power to make it happen? And then I say, contemplate that and start living your life as if you were actually doing that. Because that's the first baby step towards collectively solving the jigsaw puzzle mystery that is the conundrum of life and death, which we've neglected, avoided, and toxified in our minds and in our culture so much that we constantly butt up against it in a way that causes trauma, instead of solving the riddle so we can transcend it. Om Shanti Metta Shanti Om Namaste. Thank you for listening. That's been a me spewing out rough draft idea of dialogue that needs to be written, that I need to transcribe for myself, which is homework for later. Hopefully not too much long later. Hopefully within the same quarter as I posted it as a podcast sort of time frame. So hopefully you look forward to reading it and its extended content, because I'll always add more. Nuance always comes about when I'm sitting down and doing the writing process through the hands instead of through my mouth. But this idea came to me in the receiving place where it's like, it's got to come out of my mouth like I'm at a theater and rehearsing, and I've improvised something that the script supervisor is going to jot down and make sure that the playwright reinterprets and incorporates back into the script. Except all of those jobs are me. Thanks for supporting me and helping me do that by myself by listening to it as a podcast first. That's the goal here at this segment of the podcast, which I don't remember if it's just called Chapter 1. Is that what we're calling it? Hopefully when I play this back live, I'm also giving commentary. Back to myself live. Peace out.